Welcome to this third lecture in sociology, which will be about Max Weber and the Protestant origins of capitalism. This lecture will not only introduce you into one of the founding fathers and classics of sociology, but will also acquaint you with something like the origins of a sociology of religion, one branch of sociology. So to start with, who was Max Weber anyhow? So Max Weber, also known as one of the founder, if not the founder, of sociology, not only in Germany but also more generally, um, lived more or less at the same time of the existence of the German Empire. You recall, so this first German nation state, born in 1871 and which collapsed then at the end of the First World War. Max Weber's life did not only accidentally coincide with this first nation state, but he was also very much involved in key features of that state. So, first of all, there was a very, let's say, patriotic moment in German life, and the empire was quite nationalistic. It was also an empire in the sense that it tried to build a colonial empire, and it also tried to invade other countries than in the First World War. And Max Weber, coming from a family of politicians, also of the imperial diet, his father was a member of parliament then for the National Liberal Party. So Max Weber was also quite of a conservative nationalist in the sense, who also during the First World War, much as the French founder of sociology, wrote very nationalistic pieces. He also had a connection with the military, so not only did he do his special military service, but even at a very advanced age in World War I, he was recruited to govern a military hospital in Heidelberg. Um, Max Weber was also very much involved in, let's say, a very manly culture in the fraternities at the university, and also upheld, let's say, relatively conservative codes of conduct when it came to, for instance, honor. So he also fought for the honor of his wife Marianne Weber in a duel, for instance. Um, his family background is not just in politics, but part of his family is also from textile businessmen. So he basically writes also later on topics that he knew from his family. And his mother comes from a very strong pietist tradition. So quite an inwardly oriented branch of Protestantism, which Weber didn't practice, but which he knew quite well. Also noteworthy is his brother Alfred, who is one of the founders of economic sociology, one could say. So Weber became a professor in national economics, as it was called back in the day in the 1890s. So quite early in his career, um, and actually soon retired from university life in about 1902. Because due to a lot of overwork, he had frequent nervous breakdowns and basically continued living as a kind of private scholar. But he wasn't only a scholar, but he was an active member of the Association for Social Reform, the Verein für Sozialpolitik of his time. He had very good connections to parliamentarians of his day. He was politically active. We will encounter later in this lecture two of his important speeches he also gave for becoming politicians or academics. Um, And yes, he is also formally the founder of German sociology in 1909. He was part of the founding members of the German Sociological Association. His idea of sociology to be one that does historical comparisons of, say, ancient civilizations, empires, different countries, um, as like the dominant branch of sociology was not successful. So nowadays, this is one branch of sociology, but not what sociology is mainly about. Max Weber also edited this archive for the social sciences, one of the early um, sociological publications in Germany. Yes, as I said, due to his nervous breakdowns, he basically lived on his family and his wife's family wealth most of his productive years. Marianne Weber, his wife, was also a social reformer of her times, and yeah, is also known for quite an intimate biography about Max Weber. And she is also the one, as Dirk Kessler, whose biography here I cite, she is also the one who basically established Max Weber as the, let's say, socially constructed founder of sociology by having, after his death, a jour fixe in Heidelberg, where many of the top intellectuals of the interwar years then assembled. Talcott Parsons, the main sociologist probably in the United States between 1930 and 70, was also present there. He was the one then who translated Weber into English. You might have noticed that the text that you read for today is also from his translation. Um, and the combination of, yes, this entrepreneurial work by Marianne Weber, then also with Felke Parsons, and many of the participants of this Jour Fix then having to emigrate to the United States when the Nazis gained power. This all contributed to the status of Max Weber nowadays as the classic or even founder of sociology more general. Um, so there's no Max Weber school in a narrow sense. So he didn't have any concrete disciples, which is perhaps also a good thing. Um, but he is mostly referred to in very, let's say, many contexts. We saw, for instance, this textbook analysis in the first lecture in the history of sociology. Is a very present character. Um, he published in his lifetime already many, many texts, also participated in many debates. Then there were also many post-mortal publications of his. He had many more projects than he could realize in his lifetime, which was also relatively short because he died of basically the Spanish flu in 1920. Um, Below here at the bottom, you basically see the most recent and also recently finished um, main oeuvre by Max Weber that was critically edited. And if you read German, then I would recommend you to consult this critical edition as the reference point for his writings. His writings can generally divided into different branches. So now today we will encounter mainly the sociology of religion with the Protestant ethic, but this is a much larger project which includes also the study of all major world religions as he planned it at least. Then there's the branch of the methodology of the social sciences. So Weber, for instance, was also inspired by these neo-Kantians, whom you already know because they introduced this distinction between ideographic and nomothetic social sciences. And Weber was also basically torn a bit between these two different camps of organizing social sciences. In his major works, Economy and Society, then he basically lays the foundations of economic sociology and sociology more generally. So basically, these definitions of what sociology is supposed to be is also something contained in this work. In his earlier works in the 1890s, Weber is basically known as an agrarian sociologist. So even in American sociology, actually, rural or agrarian sociology is quite a large field. And you have to remember that sociology was founded at a time when the majority of the population, despite the ongoing urbanization, was still living in the countryside, and that the rural questions were as important as also the urban questions, even though sociology was much founded also as a science of the rising cities of its time. Um, yes, Weber's reform work also implied that he participated in writing many basically applied researches. So he investigated, for instance, uh, the problem of rural credit. He investigated the problem of rural poverty in the East Albion um, areas of Germany, and so on. Last but not least, and important also for this lecture, Weber visited the United States in 1904 for the World's Fair in St. Louis, where he didn't only have one presentation, but he also exchanged with a sociologist of his time, with Webb Du Bois in particular. He traveled the country quite a lot, visited 10 different states. He had relatives also in North Carolina, and he basically used some of this material and these impressions in his works also on the Protestant ethics, which contains also one part about the so-called Protestant sects in the United States. So let's turn a bit more concretely to the mandatory reading of today as well, which is the Protestant ethic. So at the time of writing, so in the early 20th century, what Max Weber calls the elective affinity, so basically a correlation without basically a very simple causation between Protestantism and capitalism, um, was basically known among scholars for quite some time. It was also almost a stereotype. So people knew very famous entrepreneurs of the time were rather Protestant. They knew that Protestant areas in the German Empire, perhaps even Protestant countries like Great Britain or the US, were rather the more advanced ones when compared to the Catholic areas or countries, which had perhaps something like the reputation of being laggard. So there was basically already a knowledge existing about this correlation, and there's a certain academic dispute also at the time who was actually first in coining this hypothesis about the correlation, but particularly between Werner Sombart, whom we will encounter also in the next lecture, and Max Weber. And at the time, this Protestant hypothesis, which we will talk about today, has also been called as the Troeltsch-Weber thesis. Troeltsch was a historian who traveled also with Weber to the US. All right, and Max Weber's project was not only the study of Protestantism and capitalism in particular, but his general idea was to see how processes of rationalization, of organizing life rationally, that is rule-bound, um, yeah, in bureaucracies, etc., pervaded many areas uh, of life in the West. So there's a certain Western Eurocentrism in Weber's question in the first place. The main question is basically why capitalism or this tendency of rationalization emerged, was more present in the West when compared to, yeah, mainly Eastern Eurasian countries at the time. Um, and so this question of Protestantism and capitalism was only one part of this more general idea. This becomes also more clear when you look at the preface of the text that you read for today, which is mainly about this rationalization process being more present in the West. And this is actually a preface that was added to this reworked text that was republished then in 1920, became part of the Sociology of Religion. The original text then was published in 1905 and 6 in two different pieces. It was also meant not only as a study of Protestantism and capitalism, but as a study of all major world religions, so including Judaism, Taoism, Hinduism, etc., and how their religious ethics impacted economic life. Last but not least, if this topic interests you, at the very end of his life, Weber also gave additional lectures on economic history, which are more broadly about the rise of capitalism in the West. So what is the puzzle that the Protestant ethic is an answer to? You might say that it's basically the puzzle depicted in this graph, which draws on the so-called Madison Project, which is a long-term project of actually one economist who tried to give numbers to economic development over time and across many countries since basically ancient Egypt to our current days, and which you see here denoted basically in a log scale of the GDP per capita standardized in terms of 1990 US dollars. And this graphic of the GDP development basically shows, let's say, two important facts. The one is there has been basically a stagnation of economic development over these 600 years of the early modern period until about 1750 about. And ever since, there's been almost an explosive, exponential, almost growth of economic development. So this is the first fact. The second fact is that this start of the development and the intensity has not been equal across different countries, but it mainly occurred first in the West. Here, take for instance the Great Britain, the first industrialized countries in comparison to the Chinese development, for instance. Um, and it happened also more in certain countries in the West, mainly Great Britain and then the United States. You see here the United States emerged basically as the economic leader around 1900. So when Max Weber wrote this Protestant ethic. So yeah, the second fact, basically, there's been the rise of this capitalist economic development in the West, not so much in the East, despite the recent catch-up process. And in the West, it also occurred rather in, let's say, the Protestant countries. So this becomes also visible in the graphs shown in the optional reading for today, where the two economists, Becker and Bussmann, here assembled data of the share of Protestants around 1900 on the x-axis, and again, the same measure of GDP per capita from the same medicine database that you, by the way, can also find online very simply. Um, on the y-axis, and you also basically see a split here along the Catholic and Protestant countries. There are basically three country groups which you can distinguish on this picture. On the left-hand side, you see the Catholic countries, basically almost 100% Catholic countries, which is basically Southern Europe, Latin America. Former Spanish colonies with 100% Catholics and very low GDP in comparison around 1900. Then you have the almost 100% Protestant countries on the very right-hand side. This is basically Scandinavian, perhaps also British state church countries. So where basically state and religion are one thing, and there are basically hardly any Catholics. And GDP-wise, these countries have shown, let's say, a moderate economic development. Last but not least, there are countries with mixed confessions in the middle of the graph. And here you see that those countries with higher shares of Protestant, relatively speaking, the United States, here obviously also Great Britain, they are also the ones who have the highest GDP per capita around 1900. So broadly speaking, there is a positive correlation between Protestantism, number of Protestants in the population, and GDP, even though it's not very clear cut. So let's turn to Max Weber's own basically unit of observation at the time, which is the Prussia of his day. And Prussia has the very great advantage of very good data collection. So you see here the 400 something districts of Russia that in the optional reading, basically the results are based upon. And you see here on the left-hand side, then 19th century census data of the shares of Protestants. The remainder are basically Catholics. At the time, with this distinction into, if you want, basically three different regions, those with very many majorities of Protestants, those with basically mixed confession, and then the rather Catholic regions here in blue. On the right-hand side, you see a proxy for economic development, which is, perhaps a bit strange. Teacher income by 1886. So teachers were paid a bit in accordance to the living standards of their area. So that may serve here as a proxy for economic development. And here again, you see three different kinds of regions, let's say the economically most advanced regions, which are basically in the east and west, the coal mining regions, plus the area here around Berlin and the trading routes. Then you have secondly the less economically developed regions adjacent to it, and then in the east in particular, the rather poor region of Prussia. And just from looking at it visually, you see a certain correlation going on here between regions with more Protestants and basically regions with higher economic development. So this might also be important, this basically confessional or religious map, because it is very sticky over time. So here you see on the left-hand side map of religious Germany at the end of the 30-Year War, which was in 1648. And on the right-hand side, you see present-day Germany by religious confessions. And the darker shades of gray here are the Catholic regions. And I mean, just visually, with the exception of Eastern Germany here, you see a very strong persistency of religious affiliation over here almost 400 years. So this basically writing about religion and its potential impacts is something that may still matter to the current day. This holds also for the United States, where the religious landscape is a bit different. So Weber talks about basically most of Americans pertaining in one way or the other to this, what he calls the ancient Puritan tradition. So recall the first British settlers in the 17th century were basically Puritan dissidents of the Anglican Church. And ever since, basically, um, uh, the United States have been characterized by accommodating many dissidents, but also having internally quite, let's say, diverse kind of churches. Um, Overall, the more radical and independent wing of Protestantism has always prevailed, which, for instance, led to most people not really being born into churches, but choosing one's faith. Um, it also implied also an inequality between pastors and laywomen men, um, and also a stricter moral discipline as perhaps in the Catholic Church. Also important for the entire eternal diversity of churches were the different awakening movements in the United States. The first one in the 18th century, the second one in the 19th century, which, yeah, basically the first one tried to bring the churches closer to just the everyday person. The second one also tried to bring more unchurched people into the churches, but it definitely also led to a stronger diversity of churches in the United States. The United States are also special when it comes to a sociology of religion because um, back in the day and now, it's the country with the highest absolute number of Protestants, and also with the highest frequency of church-going activity. So this is something that already Max Weber observed during his travels, that the secularization process, so basically more people turning away from religion and faith that he knew from basically his own biography, but also from the European cities of his time, was not very developed in the United States, which is a phenomenon that still is present in the current day. And basically, all of these religious particularities are not only perhaps interesting for a sociology of religion in itself, but they also have economic, socioeconomic consequences. So below you see a map of that is the percentage of Catholics in the different counties as of 1906, which I gathered from the Census of Religious Bodies, which you actually can also access for free on the internet. And you already see that this map of Catholics is shows a certain uneven distribution. So there are higher, basically, shares of Catholics in certain eastern regions than again here around Louisiana in the south. Um, and if you overlay this map of Catholics or different religious groupings with, for instance, prohibition, um, voting, or also what I did here on the map with the emergence of fire and life insurance and their size here, then you see that this religious variable is not neutral to many of these other socio-economic and political processes. Okay, but now let's turn a bit to the Protestant thesis, also the reading for today. So the Protestant thesis refers basically to this association, what you see here on what is the macro level, that is in areas with stronger Protestant doctrines when compared to other religions or let's say more traditional doctrines. For instance, the Catholic one, or also a traditional way of organizing the economy. In these areas, you also see more of an advancement of capitalism and particularly of this rational way of capitalism that involves rational calculation, bookkeeping, etc., when compared, for instance, to what Weber calls the adventure capitalism. So that is, yeah, the colonial sort of extraction capitalism, or also just the pirate kind of capitalism. So there is on the macro level, so that's why it's here on the top, this association between the Protestant areas and the richer areas in certain countries or also across different societies. And the question now is, why is this actually the case? Um, and Weber, also in his broader, let's say, economic history, cites very many, let's say, background conditions which helped to explain the rise of capitalism, and particularly in the West. So he elaborates on this being the place where rational calculation techniques, such as this double entry bookkeeping, emerged. He also observes that this is the place where modern applied sciences emerged, or where the bourgeois citizens in free cities became an important carrier in the population for the first capitalist enterprises. But despite all of these different background factors, Weber thinks that a crucial factor for explaining the rise of capitalism and capitalism in the West lies somehow in Protestantism and the Protestant doctrine. So at first, this might sound a bit far-fetched, because why would the way people believe in God or go to church on Sundays have anything to do with the very mundane economic activity that they engage in? Isn't the one a very transcendental kind of activity, the other a very mundane, worldly kind of activity? Why would they be tied together? And the innovative explanation of Weber's is to say that the Protestant doctrines, as abstract and otherworldly as it may be, influenced the individual Protestant in his or her daily, basically professional activity through the religious ethics. So this first arrow here of what is also sometimes called a Coleman's boat explanation of macro phenomena. This first arrow here describes how the macro level phenomenon, in this case the Protestant doctrines, influences, so in a way socializes here, individuals into a certain activity. So imagine here downstairs, so to speak, in this boat, we are on the micro level of individual actions taking place. So imagine here an individual Protestant who does basically perform a certain action leading into an individual level result here. So we are on the level of the micro um, or action explanation. Um, and Weber's sort of first individual micro mechanism now to say how this Protestant doctrine basically moves the individual Protestants into certain behaviors, to say that there's a certain religious ethic in Protestantism, and in particular of its Puritan kind of form, that makes individuals work even though their needs are already fulfilled. So in the traditional way of doing basically the economy of working, once you had enough, once you fulfilled your needs, you would stop working. In this Protestant mindset, however, basically you continue working despite needs being already fulfilled. So basically, you work basically for reasons other than the fulfillment of needs. And one of these reasons may be that you feel that your professional activity has a certain calling. Basically, there's a vocation associated with your profession, and this vocation might have a religious motivation. So if God called you to work as a good businessman, then obviously you don't stop once your needs are fulfilled, because basically God's calling is still working, and you still want to fulfill this vocation of being a good businessman. So in a way, your orientation in acting as a businessman is much more value-centered and not so instrumentally motivated, as would be the case in the traditional kind of economy, where you simply stop working once your needs are fulfilled. A second micro mechanism behind the macro association between Protestantism and the rise of capitalism, Weber also refers to as the ascetic compulsion to save, or also the inner worldly asceticism. And this refers basically again to a religiously motivated norm that saving is better than spending, that saving and reinvesting sort of maximizes basically God's will through our earthly activities, and that basically the chosen ones should rather lead the life of monks and nuns, of being ascetic in the world, than engaging in non-frugal ways of consumption. And from an economic perspective, this basically means that Protestants, motivated by not only the professional calling but also this asceticism, they do not only work much more than they would have to and than their Catholic peers might do, but they also basically reinvest a lot, which reinvestment is basically solving one of the crucial problems in the rise of capitalism, which is this initial accumulation of capital. One other important third ingredient and micro mechanism here in motivating individual Protestants to become economically active lies in the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. According to that doctrine, basically not all believers would basically be saved after their earthly lives, but only the happy chosen few. Part of that doctrine, however, was that it wasn't sure for people on Earth who would belong to this group of the chosen few. And you might say that, well, if I don't know whether I'm part of the chosen few, and if I can't influence it anyhow, why would I basically change my earthly behavior? And now Weber thinks that it's basically this, in a way, metaphysical uncertainty about whether you belong to the chosen or not that makes you act as if you were already among the chosen, and which basically implies that you would act in a way as to increase God's glory already in this world, so that you wouldn't wait. And out of this drive of individual uncertainty, I mean, also imagine the believers in Protestant churches being not as organized as in the Catholic churches. They basically have to live with their own doubts, whereas the Catholic can turn to the priest, um, and all of these different elements. So all of this increased uncertainty, so Weber argues, leads then to an increased economic activity as the one activity that can increase God's glory already in this world. Last but not least, on this micro level, Weber also mentions, in a way, what sociologists nowadays would call the social capital argument. That is, Protestants were also organized in communities with quite strong ties, where basically they could turn to their church members for mutual help, or also to get credit. And the ties between these well-known church members then also overcame certain problems such as creditworthiness. So there were certain, if you want, economic effects of religious communities. So this basically is a shorthand summary of the micro mechanisms that explain how individual Protestants then became economically more active than individual Catholics, or let's say people with a more traditional economic ethics. The last part in Coleman's boat is the question of how these many individual behaviors become aggregated again into the macro phenomenon, here the rise of capitalism, which we can observe on the macro level. And this is where one of Weber's famous metaphors sets in. So all of these economic individuals are obviously connected through markets and through competition. So they aggregate basically through this mechanism, which you've learned already in economics, is basically organized through this invisible hand of the market and the price setting mechanism. And this is where the iron cage comes in. So let's simply read the key passage here from Weber that mentioned the iron cage. Quote, "The Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so. For when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force. Perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burned. In Baxter's view, the care for external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak which can be thrown aside at any moment. but fate decreed that the globe should become an iron cage. Unquote. So, what does this passage tell us about how individual Protestant behavior aggregates into what we know as capitalism? Remember that we are talking about a time period when religion was actually already in decline. So less and less people, even in the United States, were probably motivated by this original Puritan logic. Very few of them were actually Calvinist and believed in the doctrine of predestination. Why is it then that capitalism was still able to thrive? And here, the basic idea is that in the very first period of capitalism emerging, these motives, these religious ethics, were important to let capitalism in a way loose, to let it off the chain. In the second phase, however, the very economic competition produced by capitalism and all of its institutions already have created a kind of iron cage, which makes the original cause for capitalism to emerge, namely this religious ethic, even obsolete. So basically, monks coming out of the monastery here in this quote were surprised about the ascetic discipline reigning in the capitalist world, even by people who were quite secular businessmen. And why would they act the way they did? Well, even the Catholic businessmen basically had to compete with the companies, perhaps originally founded by religiously motivated Protestants, and they had to compete on labor markets, on capital markets, with all of these Protestants who did overwork, who did so much reinvestment. And through this competitive pressure, then basically everyone sort of had to fulfill the norms that were originally set by an ethic that by the day, perhaps even of Weber's writing, was already not shared by the majority of the population. So let's briefly recall what we learned here. I used James Coleman's so-called Coleman's boat here, which is basically just a decomposition of a complex explanation into a macro explanation and a micro explanation with basically a connection between the two. So I use this Coleman's boat to elaborate why Protestantism is associated with capitalism. And Weber's main explanation has been that the link that ties the two is the Protestant doctrine that motivates an individual level kind of religious ethic, which is based on this idea of the profession being a vocation and that there's a professional calling for the Protestant to engage in economic activity, not to basically earthly benefits, but to increase the glory of God in this world, basically overworking, overinvesting, and by way of aggregation, forcing even the Catholics into this economic game of competition. In the optional reading, this Protestant thesis of Weber's is not completely criticized. So the two authors, they show, as we saw on the maps, that there is this macro association, but they doubt that it is due to this religious ethic. And they find that the main mechanism they suggest between Protestantism and capitalism is the education system. So you recall Protestants with Martin Luther onwards, always emphasizing Bible reading, etc. They established schooling much earlier than Catholic countries. And in economic parlance, increase the human capital necessary for capitalism to develop. So Weber's Protestant ethic is only a starting point for a broader sociology of religion. I already mentioned that he himself had this large project to compare the different world religions and their religious ethics to understand why, for instance, capitalism did not emerge in China or did not emerge in Islamic countries. Ever since, there has been more research also following up on Weber. One is, for instance, Daniel Bell's article here, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where in the post Second World War era, Bell makes the observation that the rise of the consumer society could actually undermine the very conditions that capitalism rests on, namely this ascetic life that is at the heart of the labor market of capitalism. And he asks in his Cultural Contradiction of Capitalism whether it isn't the case that this rise of the consumer society isn't in the long run basically undermining capitalism. So in a way, the first generation builds the house of capitalism and the second generation eats it. Um, a second updating of Weber's is in Boltanski and Eve Chapalo's New Spirit of Capitalism, where they observe that these sort of Protestant values inspired very much the kind of Protestant entrepreneur um, of Weber's time period. They also observe how it's built over into basically these what they call the heroic directors of these large bureaucratic corporations that companies in the 20th century and the post-Second World War era have become. But they also noticed then that ever since the 1970s, it wasn't so much about individuals and their virtues, but about these flexible networks and basically manager teams that were the new spirit of capitalism. And they show that there's been a redefinition of this spirit of capitalism on the basis of analyzing many of these manager textbooks and the business press. But the works of Weber has also inspired research in different areas than just capitalism. One is the so-called Merton thesis. You already know Robert K. Merton from the first two lectures, self-fulfilling prophecy or reference group are two of the key terms he coined. And he wrote his dissertation basically about the rise of modern experimental science and links the rise of science to basically Protestantism in Great Britain and in Germany. Also starting from this very mundane observation that, I mean, think about it, many of these classical scientists in the natural experimental sciences, they were Protestants, right? They were not necessarily Catholics. And this is also known as the Merton hypothesis. Philip Gorski then is a sociologist of religion of our days who extended in a way the Protestant hypothesis into the creation of the modern state by what he calls the so-called disciplinary revolution. So he sees particularly the Calvinist, more so than the Lutheran and much more so than the Catholic doctrine as an important ingredient in creating this modern state, the modern bureaucracy, the surveys, the census, the counting, etc. Zikron Karl is another sociologist of religion at Yale who links the different denominations in Protestantism, so namely the free or reformed Protestants and the state church kind of Protestant on the one hand, and then the Catholic denominations on the other hand, to the different poor ethics. And she characterizes the free or reformed Protestant poor ethics mainly by making a distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, who basically don't get anything, a bit like in the American welfare state, and by using the so-called indoor relief institutions, so basically workhouses where you lock the deserving poor into in order to teach them how to work. And this is opposed to the Catholic kind of feed them all poor ethics in the 18th, 19th century, where outdoor relief is also used, so no workhouses. Philip Marno extends this association between the kind of religion a country has and the kind of welfare state a country has. And we will see this also in a later lecture, but he sees these Lutheran state church countries as the ones being associated with the universal, the broadest welfare states. So think about Sweden or Finland here. He links the Catholic countries to the conservative family-centered welfare states, so think about Belgium or France. And he links the Reformed Protestants, so American Puritan tradition, also Anglican Church in Great Britain, to the liberal welfare states. So the basically smallest kinds of welfare state provisions and much more private provision. Last but not least, let me create a link here between the lecture and my own research. I have been working also on a link between the kind of religion predominant in the country and the degree to which it relies on private insurance solutions in life insurance and also non-life insurance. And there I also have been finding that if you divide countries by Catholic, the Free Protestant, and the State Protestant countries, then you also find that ever since the 1850s up to the current day, the basically Free Protestant and American sort of Anglo countries have had the highest coverage here as the premium payments per GDP on an annual basis of private life insurance and non-life insurance across all countries. And they basically have been followed by the state Protestant countries, and the basically laggards in private insurance development are the Catholic countries, with the exception here of the socialist countries. Okay, so in all of these areas, the Protestant thesis sort of is still an important reminder that in a broader sociology of religion, what confession you have, basically what confession is dominant in a country or area, is important for many different outcomes. And one such outcome, remember Philip Gorski here, is also the kind of bureaucratic institutions and governance. So in Protestant countries, we saw there was much earlier state building and bureaucracies were a broader phenomenon. So Weber is also known for coining this term of different, let's say, types of governance, type of authorities, which basically are characterized by different types of what is legitimate, what is accepted as a form of denomination. If you have large societies, there are always forms of domination going on, and there are many problematic forms which are not justified, not even in the society. And there are also forms of domination which are justified within a society. This depends on the time period and on the country, what is justified and what is not justified. And Weber just offers what he calls an ideal type. So basically, a distinction that is never fully realized in the real world, but which helps us to understand and to compare the different existing societies in a given world. And when it comes to the type of legitimate domination and authority, Weber distinguishes three different types. One is the legal or bureaucratic kind of authority. One is the charismatic type, and one is the traditional type. So the legitimation of the traditional type is basically you are allowed to dominate us because traditionally this has always been this way. So this is, for instance, an ideal type that may be realized in a patriarchy, which has always been the case, and where basically what existed yesterday is also taken as source of legitimation for today. This obviously has been questioned over time. But yeah, this is an example for the traditional kind of governance type. The second, the charismatic type. So here you are allowed to govern us, to dominate us, because of the particular charisma. And I mean, Weber wrote before the emergence of what you might call charismatic fascism. But when you think about the 1930s in Europe, then there were a number of leaders, Hitler, obviously, amongst others, who were able to convince people to be dominated through their charisma. Charismatic form of governance obviously has the problem that it's very much tied to an individual ruler and that it's difficult to basically bequeath that charisma on like a follower or even upon an institution once this originally charismatic ruler is gone. Let's turn to the third type of authority or legitimate domination, which Weber calls the legal authority or the bureaucratic mode of governance. The key characteristics of this ideal typical notion of bureaucracies, something that Weber elaborates on in his Economy and Society and also a bit in his vocation lecture on politics as vocation. Here are some of the key characteristics. So these ideal typical bureaucracies, they are made up of an expert staff, that is civil servants in state bureaucracies, but can also be just employees in corporations. They receive a special training and they have a very clearly demarcated field of competence where they exercise basically rule-bound conduct. Very prescribed rules of what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, what they're competent to do, what they're not competent to do. They enter their office basically contractually. They don't inherit the office. Yeah, they don't buy the office, and they basically make the office their primary occupation. In many of these bureaucracies, there's a clear career path of promotions over time. There's a seniority principle, perhaps, but it's not a kind of job where you enter, go out again, where you're hired and fired. It's basically a kind of vocation as well. It defines someone's identity, and it's definitely not something that you can simply buy or inherit from your parents. There is, in a way, a certain meritocracy in receiving the office. The bureaucracies are hierarchically structured. There's a clear division of labor, and there's also the written principle for the most important procedures. Last but not least, there's a clear separation of the ownership of the bureaucratic means of production and the employees in a given office. So the employees may sit at a desk, for instance, but they don't own the desk. They also don't own the office. Um, so there's basically no appropriation of a certain office position by the incumbent person. Also something that historically has had variance, but is not part of what Weber considers here the ideal, typical modern bureaucracy. So in a way, there's no corruption of offices, to put it that way. So these are some of the key characteristics for the legal authority bureaucratic way of governance, where basically the formal rules abstractly applied are one of the key features that distinguishes it from the charismatic ruler or the traditional rule, who might often apply very arbitrary ways of handling individual cases. So Weber was generally very positive about this kind of bureaucracy in a normative evaluation. Today, I think bureaucracy has rather a red tape sort of negative reputation when you listen to conservative politicians. But Weber, being rather conservative himself, rather highlighted the efficiency gains of bureaucracies that were even adopted in his time by private corporations as um, apparently the kind of governance form they copied from modern states as the more efficient one. But Weber also highlights basically the democratic leveling effect. So everyone sort of gets treated the same way, regardless of who the civil servant, who the employee is, and regardless of who the person is in need of something from the bureaucracy. He does, however, highlight that bureaucracies may come at the cost of a certain freedom because it's basically just based on formal rationality, on formalistic also impersonality. And when you think about the misuse of the German bureaucracy in the organization of the Holocaust, Weber's warnings about the potential downsides of these efficiently working bureaucracies without any substantive rationality values behind it should become very evident. Let me finish with Weber's second lecture, vocation lecture, which is not politics as a vocation, but science as a vocation. And I can recommend you reading these lectures in case you plan to embark on a career in science or in politics. These lectures are obviously 100 years old. When Weber gave these lectures in front of students in Munich and Vienna, but I think they contain still quite important wisdom, important for the careers of our days as well. And Weber, I mean, being a scientist himself, also sees how the process of rationalization, of organizing things rationally, has invaded the modern science, and that there as well, there is a certain contradiction between this inner vocation and passion that one does science with, and the form of organization which in the modern form requires such a high degree of specialization that this inner vocation and passion that you do science with is sometimes lost. And to conclude this lecture, I would simply ask you to read this text and to read also this lecture if you think that science or politics could be your future vocation.